The origin of the custom of using ashes as a religious ritual, a religious symbol, actually is lost in the prehistory of mankind. But we do find in our religious tradition, we do find references in the Judeo Christian tradition of the practice and the use of ashes. When it first started, we don't know that long history. It's lost in the prehistory of mankind. But what we do today on this Ash Wednesday, at least for us Catholics, we can trace back to at least over 3,000 years. For 3,000 years, it has been part of our tradition. In fact, when you look at the Bible, you look at the book of the prophet Jeremiah, he tells all the people, the Israelites, he's prophesying to them, and he tells them because of their sins that they are to put on sackcloth and roll in ashes. And even the great prophet Isaiah says that it comes a time when you have to declare a day of penance. So that it says that a man will bow his head like a reed in sorrow, and then they are to put on sackcloth and ashes. And the prophet Daniel reminded the people that they had to turn to God with prayer, fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. And probably one of the great stories that we know from the Old Testament, the story of Jonah, who was sent to the big city of Nineveh to prophesy to that city because of their lives that destruction would come. And it was a huge city. It tells us it took him 3 days to walk from one end to the other. And after he did, telling people, the king of Nineveh declared a fast. He said everybody, even animals, were to put on sackcloth and ashes. The prophetess Judith, the Old Testament prophetess Judith, tells us that the people prostrated themselves, they bowed down in front of the temple in Jerusalem, and then she said, as a sign of their sorrow, they threw ashes on their head. And Judas Maccabee, the day before he was to go into battle against the king of Syria, Judas Maccabee and all of his soldiers declared a day of fast before they would go into battle. And that would be the battle where they would defeat the Hasmonean king, and actually Jerusalem would be reconquered, and the great feast of Hanukkah would take place. But before the battle, in preparation for the battle, and also to renounce their sins, the soldiers, he declared a day of fast, and they sprinkled ashes on them. And even Jesus, in the New Testament, tells us about the cities of Tyre and Sidon. And he said if they had seen the witnesses that Jesus did, he said they would have reformed and repented in sackcloth and ashes. Even in the early church. In the early church, before adults and children were baptized, because generally they were all baptized at the Easter Vigil, before they were baptized, ashes were put on their forehead as a sign of their sinfulness, as a sign of their mistakes. And then at baptism, obviously, all washed clean. But the oldest written evidence that we have of Ash Wednesday, all this tradition comes to us. We find a book, it's called a pontifical, much like the book I'm going to use in a few moments to bless the ashes. It was a Romano Germanicum Pontifical, dated the year 960. Of course, the practice was before that, but that's when that was dated. It's the oldest book we still have surviving. And it says, on the Wednesday of the beginning of the season of Lent, the people are to do penance, to fast, and ashes are put on their forehead. For 3,000 years, our ancestors have followed that. Ashes are a time for us to remind ourselves to turn away from sin, to be faithful to the gospel. As the second reading tells us, Lent is our time. It's a time of a conversion for us. It's a time to look at our lives and a time for us to effect change in our lives. For thousands and thousands of years, God's people, first the Jewish people, then us, God's people have always used ashes as a sign of sorrow, as a sign of our own sinfulness, to remind us to do what we can to imitate Christ, to turn away from sin, and to be faithful to the gospel.